I have often told you that I've been blessed to know some really smart people in my life: Mitt Romney, John Roberts, Richard Nixon. I always tell people, and they don't believe me, the smartest guy I know is Dan Poneman, who I met in college some 48 years ago. And Dan is too humble to acknowledge that. But he joins us this morning because he is Mr. Nuclear. He is former Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration. He also worked for George H.W. Bush on the National Security Council when he was a young man. He has never not been Mr. Nuclear. Good morning, Dan. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Hugh. Great to see you.
Now, I want to begin by telling people when we talk about nuclear power, and we're going to talk about nuclear power here because it's breaking out, I do so with an unabashed enthusiast, even though he is a Democrat, and even though he might be an independent, and even though he is very much concerned with global warming. You have never not been a fan of nuclear energy. Is that a fair thing to say, Dan Poneman?
Well, I would say I learned about it first, and what I learned told me, as Eisenhower told us in 1953, that if we harness it responsibly, it can bring enormous benefit to humanity.
Now, one of our mutual friends, the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates to the United States, Youssef Al Otaiba, told me that you were instrumental in getting their nuclear power program underway. What is it that UAE did? Because I think we're going to see a lot more of that around the world, and I want the same standard to be established.
It's a great story, Hugh, because they came to us when I was still working with General Scowcroft in the early 2000s and said, we have enormous power demands coming up for desalination, for urbanization, and so forth, and we don't have the infrastructure. So we need to either build a massive amount of coal or a massive amount of nuclear, and we don't have either. And they were already committed, you may know about their Masdar project, to a low carbon future. And so they were very attracted to nuclear energy. And in talking to people in the United States, my colleagues and I at Skokov Group, we said, look, the logic and the economics that you're sketching out to us make all kinds of sense. But it's a very dangerous neighborhood, and so you should probably be sure to assure the international community that your intentions are peaceful. So they, from the very beginning, said we are going to build nuclear power reactors. We're not going to build the dangerous fuel cycle facilities that cause concern in terms of enriched uranium or plutonium that could be diverted. And after that, they hired the highest qualified regulators. They hired the highest qualified security experts, and they did not cut any corners. They put the most responsible regulatory regime in effect. It's very rigorous. They put the most contract controlled project on the planet to work so that their project came in on budget and on time. And it really became the example of how to do a new nuclear power program from scratch responsibly. And now they have four beautiful reactors at Baraka. I've been there a couple times in the desert, providing enormous amounts of clean energy to the UAE.
Now, this is the future for every developing country, but it also might be the future for the United States, which brings me to two stories, the reason I asked Dan to come back. Story number one comes from September. Why Microsoft made a deal to help restart 3 Mile Island. Story number two came from the Financial Times only a couple of days ago. Google orders small modular nuclear reactors for its data centers. I want to ask you about both of those in turn because they're very different stories. Dan Poneman, why did Microsoft buy 3 Mile Island?
Hugh, the context of this is the AI revolution. There is a vertiginous increase in electricity demand in this country and globally. Electricity demand, as you know, had been very, very flat for a long period of time. Now, according to the US Department of Energy, in 2023, they estimated we need 700 gigawatts of new power generation just between now and 2050 to hit net zero targets. And then just a few weeks ago, they modified that number to up to 900 gigawatts, 200 gigawatts of new power. It's extraordinary. Just for data centers alone, the demand in the United States is going from about 20 gigawatts now to 70 gigawatts in 2030. And we need every jot and tittle of power to satisfy that burgeoning need. We want to win the AI race, as you know. And these companies, the hyperscalers, Amazon, Google, Meta, all of them want clean energy. And there's only one way to get massive amounts of clean energy deployed at scale in the U.S. grid, and that's nuclear. And that's what you're seeing in that story. So there you have a recently closed nuclear power plant. It's tragic that so many very good, well operated plants had to shut down in recent years for a variety of market distortions. And now they said, look, we need that power. We're going to reopen that plant. And Constellation Power has agreed to buy 20 years worth of output of that formerly shuttered 3 Mile Island plant, which was always a good plant. It was not the unit that was affected by the accident back in '79. And I think you will see more plants if those that have been shut recently and are still able to be recovered can be recovered. People are going to be taking a very close look at doing that.
Now, Dan Poneman, I used to live next to San Onofre. President Nixon put his office next to San Onofre. That was, to me, the demonstration that if the President of the United States doesn't worry about nuclear power plants, I shouldn't worry about nuclear power plants. Is there any life left in San Onofre, to your knowledge? I mean, how many plants are out there that can be repurposed, reopened, and put to use?
Distressingly few, because what happens, Hugh, is after a while you do things in the decommissioning phase that are very hard to reverse. San Onofre shut down long ago enough. I doubt that they are a likely candidate. But just in the last few years, Hugh, we had 100 up to 104 operating reactors, and now with Vogel, I think we're at 94 again. So, but I think probably to take an initial look, some of those 10 may be able to be restarted. Palisades, I think you're going to see being restarted, but it's going to have to be done really on a case by case basis to see how far along in the decommissioning process they are, if they can basically reverse it.
If a company came to you and they are an AI driven company, whether it's Meta or Google or Amazon, and they want to get as much power secured as they can, as quickly as they can, would you advise them to go buy one of the old plants and get it open that can be opened, or go and get the new modular nukes that Google is investing in?
Well, it's going to depend on their specific circumstances, where they need the power, what they need. Basically, you've heard me, you've heard my successor, Dan Bria, talk about all of the above. They're going to look at everything. They're going to look at existing plants and whether they can be uprated, take existing plants and just increase the capacity of those plants to produce. They will look, and they have looked at recently shuttered plants to see which of those can be reopened. They will certainly look, and you've seen that in the recent announcements from Google, for example, and Amazon at the small modular reactors that are now very popular. But given the enormous scale, Hugh, of the demand that I'm telling you about, they're going to look at building brand new plants. Now, there was some distress because the big plants that were finished down in Georgia, the sort of classic 1,000 megawatt plants, were obviously very late and very over budget. But we have a steep learning curve. But to fill the hole that I'm telling you about that are in tens of gigawatts or over time hundreds of gigawatts, I predict you are going to see all of this. You're going to see old plants reopened. You're going to see existing plants uprated. You're going to see small modular reactors, and you're going to see big reactors, that sort of traditional one gigawatt reactors. I think all of that is in play.
Now, Dan Poneman, on Monday of this week, the Fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I hosted some of our friends in Maine that we won't be seeing until the spring, because we're leaving on tomorrow to come back to the Beltway. And one of them is Tony. One nickname is Two Speeds Tony because he goes fast and faster in his boat. And the other one is Tony CRE because he's the best commercial real estate expert in Maine. And I asked him, where would you put him in Maine? He said, well, there are at least 4 sites that could be permitted pretty quickly if we got people interested in that. Can modulars work in every state?
Well, I haven't done a geological study, but to a first order, small modular reactors have a much smaller footprint, much smaller exclusion zone. So I would say to a first order, it's highly likely that they are going to be deployable virtually anywhere. I would note Bill Gates, in his excellent book about avoiding a climate disaster, makes a one sentence argument for nuclear power. And he basically says it is the only form of carbon free power that has been proved to work day and night, season in, season out, deployable virtually anywhere in the world, that has been proved to work at large scale. So I think the SMR footprint of available sites is vast and certainly satisfactory for the need.
I have never heard of Kairos until this week. Are there other Kairoses out there, or do they have first mover advantage in small nuclear reactors, SMRs they're called, small modular
No, there's
reactors?
Yeah, there's a whole wave, Hugh. I mean, think of the automobile industry in the early 1900s. A lot of companies out there, the Stanley Steamer and many others. So there's a thing called the Advanced Reactor Development Program that selected 10 reactors, two for big demonstration projects. One of those is called TerraPower, which is a company founded by Bill Gates that has a liquid sodium reactor. One that's called X Energy that uses a high temperature gas cooled reactor. There are light water based reactor designs that are out there, such as the GE BWRX 300, such as NuScale, such as Holtec. There are other liquid metal designs such as Oklo. So it's a very exciting phase in the industry. A lot of innovation, and frankly, one of the things that has to happen is we need to see what we're now starting to see, which is major investments being made in some of these, including Kairos, which is a great company. And that's really going to separate the wheat from the chaff, because now you have literally dozens of these designs that are out there being promoted. And between the need to downsize in terms of how much regulatory burden the NRC can manage and the need for sort of capital to migrate to a certain few reactors that can be successful as opposed to spreading the resources over too many reactors that none of them get developed, you're going to see, I think, a number getting developed because they have different use cases. The last thing I'll say about this is, for example, in the advantages that these small reactors have over conventional ones, some of them have very high outlet temperatures. And that's the attractive thing which led X Energy to do a deal with Dow Chemical, because we have to not only decarbonize power generation, we have to decarbonize industry. And they're going to be building a plant down in Seadrift, Texas, that's going to support the production of all kinds of chemical products and plastics and so forth. And Nucor Steel also is a tremendous industry leader in this. You're going to increasingly see small modular reactors being used to promote not only electricity generation, but also other industrial processes.
Now, Dan Poneman, this one is a little bit inside baseball. When we graduated in 1978, we were 1 year away from 3 Mile Island. And 3 Mile Island happened, and it created a fear factor that has taken forever. The long tail of that fear factor is about gone now, but it was immense. What it did have as a second order impact was not only create fear in the public, it drove people out of the industry. Nuclear engineers didn't want to work in a field where there wasn't a demand for their services. The good news is that the United States Navy has never stopped turning out nuclear engineers and people who can operate these plants. So, my question, are there enough professionals to scale up our nuclear industry right now and in the next 5 to 10 years?
Not yet. This is a huge issue. You've properly flagged it. You also pointed out the good news is the Navy never stopped and has had a tremendous record of excellence and safety. And you see now more and more people pouring into this because, and this is in not just in the last year, but in recent years, the bow wave of enthusiasm behind nuclear has begun to repair this gap. But for example, when I was Deputy Secretary of Energy, we had a tremendous problem performing and executing projects on time and on budget for the reason you said. You stop building reactors for 30 years. What do you think happens to your supply chain? What do you think happens to your talent pool? But now people are putting their shoulder to the wheel. Kids are excited. I've talked to a lot of them. There's programs all over the country. And so I think that it can scale up to meet the need. You and I, Hugh, are both huge students of history. And when you think back in 1940, when they didn't have enough horses, they decided to build a new machine to pull artillery on Europe. 9 weeks later, Willie's Jeep in Ohio comes up with the new design, and by 1944, we built 640,000 of them. So when the country puts its mind to a big task, we can get the talent to get the job done.
So let me ask this, Dan. I think we had a major milestone this week with the chopsticks recovery of the rocket booster. It sort of relit the imagination of the American public about what we can do when you find people like Musk and you find companies like Starlink. What was your reaction to seeing that? Were you've been a science guy for a long time. Did it not surprise you? Because it astonished me.
Well, it was fascinating to see it happen because this is, as you know, in the days of Werner von Braun, they thought about can you get this thing to land again, and they decided to go the disposable route. But what it really shows you, Hugh, is the tremendous innovative capacity of America. I'm going back to our alma mater to do a project I'm calling, and they said it couldn't be done, about technologies the United States invented, dominated, squandered our lead, and got it back. And commercial space launch is one of them. We had this horrible period in which we lost the ability to lift commercial payloads. You had deltas exploding on the pad. You had the Challenger disaster. We were relying on Europeans, Arianespace, and believe it or not, we were relying on Russian rocket engines, the RD-180, to get commercial payloads to space. NASA put a really smart program in place. It was called the COTS program, and that was what enabled new entrants like SpaceX and Blue Origin to come into that market space. And now, with the incredible chopstick recovery that you saw the other day, now you see the benefits of all that.
Do you think that film has an impact on a rising generation as to what is possible and where they might want to put their efforts in school?
Absolutely. I mean, these things are so exciting, and we see it in this area, and space is inherently exciting. You see it in nuclear, and another place I would say you see it in the semiconductor industry. You had Robert Noyce at Fairchild inventing the semiconductor, the Apollo program and ICBM programs that were in the early 60s lifted that whole industry. Then we were worried about Japan Inc. moving in. We got the leadership back, we lost it, and now we have the CHIPS Act. So there are a number of areas. That's why I call this project I'm working on, and they said it couldn't be done. We can do it, and I would posit to go back to the top of your storyline that we can do it in nuclear as well. We invented that technology, we dominated it for decades. Somehow we lost our way, and now we're at the beginning phases of getting it back.
Now, let's talk lastly, Dan, about the near term future, not 5 years, but 10 to 20 years out. What will the landscape look like in power generation in the United States? Because you concern yourself with all of the above. So give us what you expect the power generation to look like. And I'll preface it by this. Doug Burgum is your kindred, is your brother whom you've never met, the governor of North Dakota. He's our age. All he ever wants to talk about is energy production, carbon capture, making clean energy, and nukes because he's a Silicon Valley guy, and he knows that AI sucks up so much power that we're going to lose to the Chinese unless we double and triple our base load energy capacity. So, what do you think the landscape looks like in 5 to 10 years, maybe even 15 to 20?
Okay, so I will start with that DOE report of March 2023. And they said at that point, they were looking at 700 gigawatts of new power. They saw 500 gigawatts of renewable and 200 gigawatts of nuclear. So I think probably it's going to look like that. I think you're going to see a lot of gas plants because although these new hyperscalers are very excited about nuclear, much as I'd like to snap my fingers and have nuclear power plants sprout up everywhere, it's going to take a number of years. They're not going to let their shareholders wait a number of years to get the benefit of their investments. So I think you're going to see more gas plants. I don't think you're probably going to see more coal plants for obvious reasons. But I think you're going to see a basic shift toward nuclear, uh, more renewables, more gas plants, and probably less coal. I think that's the overall profile. But let me tell you something that your listeners may not know. We all see these curves and we think, oh, the evolution of energy. You had the age of the sailboats, sailing ships. Then you had the age of wood burning. Then you had the age of coal, and then you had oil. Then you had gas. And people see these as curves rising and falling. But the fact of the matter is, the United States and all people are using more of every kind of energy every year. More coal, more wood, more wind, more water power. The only energy form that's gone down over time is whale oil. All right. So you're going to be seeing a lot of all these things. And outside of the United States, you're still going to be seeing a lot of coal. Last I looked, China put 35 gigawatts of new coal on the grid last year. And whatever you think about the carbon footprint of coal, there's a reality factor out there that places like India, China, Southeast Asia are still going to be, I think, building coal plants.
Well, that brings me back to where we began, where I wanted to close. I began by asking you about the project that you helped in the United Arab Emirates, the 4 reactors there. Do we trust other countries to keep to the same gold standard that the UAE established and abided by? Or are you worried when you see reports of modular reactors going into unstable regions in the world?
Okay, so I will not to quibble, but on another show we'll talk about the so-called gold standard, which isn't gold and isn't standard and was a complete misconception. But I'll get to the nub of your question. We cannot take anything for granted, and that's why the UAE project was so important. People in other countries need to look at the UAE, how to do a project smart and how to do it right. And we need to have continued vigilance, not only within these countries, but these countries need to adhere to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, has over 190 parties, probably the most successful treaty in history. And it's astonishing that here we are 80 years after World War II, we've only got 9 nuclear weapon states. So I would say Eisenhower's right in 1953. We can do this responsibly and well. And if countries live up to the very high standards for nonproliferation set initially by President Eisenhower, codified first in the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is led by this outstanding Argentine diplomat, Rafael Grossi, fulfilling all of the nuclear suppliers group dual use export controls. We can do this right. We can do this smart. And if we can keep that level of vigilance and peer review, and the International Atomic Energy Agency continuing to impose safeguards, cameras, seals, lights, preventing, or I shouldn't say preventing, but assuring timely detection of any possible diversions, we can continue to do this. And frankly, Hugh, we have to do this because, in my humble opinion, the fate of the planet hangs in the balance. There's no responsible analytical work I know of out there, whether it's by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the International Energy Agency, that would suggest to you that we can solve the climate crisis, meet our international obligations under Paris or any other regime you can imagine without probably tripling nuclear. And I'll tell you this because your friends in the UAE hosted the COP28 Conference of Parties last year in Dubai, and over 20 countries, including the United States, pledged to triple nuclear capacity by 2050 to meet climate goals. I think that is a trend that is likely to continue, and it has to continue if, in my judgment, we're going to get the job done.
Well, that's news to me. I didn't even know that meeting occurred. I mean, some things just don't get covered, and so I don't know about that. Didn't get covered, did it?
Oh, it got a lot of coverage. It's every year, Hugh, there's a different one. This coming one, they're all called COP with a number after it. COP 28 was hosted by UAE. COP 29 is coming up next month, and it's being hosted by Azerbaijan and Baku. So every year, and the last one was important because they have what they call a global stock take of how well the planet is progressing in meeting the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement targets. And perhaps the last thing I'll be able to tell you is a sad thing, which is we are like way off track. We've blown past 1.5 degrees centigrade, and unless we triple nuclear, we're never going to get back on track.
Well, let me close on something more optimistic than that. Are there any funds out there, any venture capitalist funds, any VCs who are solely dedicated to nuclear, that they only want people to invest who believe in this future of small modular reactors?
This is starting, Hugh. It's starting because for a long time, anybody was interested in investing in nuclear, a pure nuclear play, very hard because these new reactor developers, most of them were privately held, and the utilities that build them have many assets that are not nuclear. So if you wanted to make a pure nuclear investment in public markets, it was very, very difficult. A couple of companies have now gone through these so-called SPACs. So you now have New Scale and Oklo that you can invest in, as another matter. But because of that lack, there is a space for private equity, and a number of private equity investors and funds are looking at investing not only in the reactor designers, but also in the supply chain. Because one thing we know is that if you don't have a supply chain that can keep up with the actual reactors getting built, then you're going to have those same cost and schedule problems that have dogged the industry for so many years. So the short answer is the private capital, there's a lot of private capital is very interested in that space. I think you're going to be seeing more of them getting involved. And as you see announcements like we had in the last few weeks from Amazon, from Google, from Constellation, from Microsoft, I think that private equity is going to be following that level of demand, very interested in that, and you're going to see more private capital available.
I lied. One more question, Dan. I promised to get you out after 30 minutes, but I have one more question. Is the grid up to where it needs to be to accept the new energy that will be flowing to it from the new small modular reactors over the next 20 years? Does the grid exist to accept the power and move it to where it's needed?
Generally speaking, in the United States, the grid is in good shape. You have to have things that will adjust to the realities of the new energy forms. By that, I mean, for example, a good case is the TerraPower, the Bill Gates reactor getting built in Wyoming. You have grids that are challenged when you get more and more renewables placed on the grid because there's an imbalance. So you see this in California, right, where you build, or frankly, in some cases, overbuild renewables, and then you have a huge surge of available renewables during the daytime or when it's windy, and then you got to make sure that when it's not, that you have something to backstop it. And that's where a reactor like the TerraPower reactor can churn 24 hours a day, and if the electrons are not needed for the grid, for the consumer's use at a certain point, they can heat salt, and the whole salt can serve as a de facto battery for a solar plant that can't run when it's nighttime. And so you can even out the load, is what I'm saying, by designing the grid intelligently. You will need, especially in respect to renewables, high voltage, long distance transmission. But as you know, the politics of getting those long distance, high voltage transmission approved over several jurisdictions is not an easy thing to do. So I think that that's another reason why deploying nuclear in many places, including small and micro nukes, and potentially, Hugh, I know you're interested in national security, microgrids can be very helpful in making sure that our essential defense installations get powered, even if there's a cyber attack by China or somebody else. So I think to a first order, our grid is in good shape. I'm sure you're going to need, and you're going to see more high voltage transmission. But to the extent that nuclear can be deployed in a wide variety of places, it presents, frankly, fewer challenges to the grid than sometimes deploying grid where there is a wind resource very high in one place, but the load is actually far away.
Dan Poneman, my genuine thanks for explaining. I put a request out to Elon Musk to come on the program, and I worry about how will it translate to me. And I'm sure that he'll be as good as you are at explaining. If not, you can sit next to me and tell me what he said. Thank you, Dan Poneman. I appreciate the update, as does the country.